Chapter 4 is on the legislative branch. First off, remember the legislative branch is outlined in Article 1 of the United States Constitution, and so the chapter begins with the basics, and the basics are the kind of the freebie questions. If they pop up on the exam, you've got to get them. So we know the difference between the House and the Senate, and so we remember there's 435 members in the United States Senate. You have to be 25 years old minimum to be a House rep, and you have to be a U.S. citizen for 7 years according to Article 1 to be eligible. You'll serve a 2-year term as a House rep, and the only other requirement is that you have to reside in the state with which you represent. In the Senate, there are 100 members. They have to be a little older. They have to be 30 years old. They have to be U.S. citizens for 9 years. Their term is 6 years in total. The one thing that makes the Senate a little bit unique is even though the terms are 6 years, the Senate is what we refer to as a continuous body. The book uses this phrase that the elections are staggered. Of every 2 years, approximately 1/3 of the members of the United States Senate are up for re-election. So if your term began in 2018, it'll be over in 2024. Some other senators, their term begins in 2020 and it will end in 2026. So that's what we refer to as a continuous body because there's never one election in which all members of the Senate can be removed from office. The next kind of centerpiece of understanding for the Congress is recognizing the powers they've had. We've talked about many of these things already when we talked about federalism. The powers of Congress are outlined in Article 1, Section 8. So you should be able to go back there or recall from Article 1, Section 8. Congress has powers that fall under a few different umbrellas. A couple of those examples are Congress has economic powers. Those are like the powers to regulate interstate trade, to coin money. They've got power over foreign policy. The United States Senate, for example, has the power to approve treaties. Congress as a whole has the power to declare war. Those are foreign policy powers. And then national security and foreign policy, sometimes there's some intertwining here, but with national security, the president's in charge of the military, but it's Congress that appropriates money to the military, so they have a large role in the national security element of our country also. One of the main powers they have are the powers to check the other branches of government. You should really be able to give multiple examples of checks and balances that the Congress has over the other branches. I'm going to highlight one of them because they have the same power over both branches. They have the power to impeach. Okay. Impeachment is a process the College Board loves to ask questions about because kids miss these questions all the time. The impeachment process is a 2-step process. If you are impeached, all right, to be impeached means you get past step 1. Bill Clinton, President Clinton, was impeached. You get impeached by a majority vote in the United States House of Representatives. All impeachment really means by definition is you're indicted. In other words, they've said there's enough evidence, we're going to put you on trial. If you get impeached, you go to the Senate and the Senate holds a trial. The Senate has to decide whether to convict you on those charges or not. In order to convict someone of impeachment charges, you need a 2/3 vote in the United States Senate. Right? Bill Clinton certainly was not impeached. There have been a couple, he was impeached, but he was never convicted. And so you have to get past step 2 to be removed from office. No president's ever been removed from office, but judges can be, and there have been a couple examples of federal judges being removed from office through that 2-step process. Another significant power that Congress has is the power of legislative oversight. It's a term you really need to be comfortable with. Oversight is basically the idea that Congress has the authority to keep an eye and a responsibility to keep an eye on the executive branch, the federal bureaucracy, to make sure they're doing their job properly. With oversight, what they'll do is they'll conduct hearings, they'll conduct investigations, they might bring members of the president's cabinet or different federal bureaucratic agencies in for a grilling, if you will. They'll ask him or her questions to make sure that money is being appropriated properly, that the laws or the regulations are being implemented properly. And so Congress feels that they have a huge role to make sure that what they have orchestrated through legislation is being applied properly through the executive branch, through the power of legislative oversight. Some other things that the textbook focuses upon in regards to Congress is the elections of and sometimes the intricacies, if you will, of getting elected to Congress. If you're elected to the House, you're elected to what's referred to as a single member district. Right? Since 1842 and the Apportionment Act, each member of the House represents a single district. So as most of you are a member of the 6th District in the United States, or in the state of Illinois, the 6th District of Illinois, Sean Casten is the one representative. It's a single member district for all the people in that one district. On the other hand, if you're a senator for any state, it's not a single member setup. You are a senator at large. In other words, there are 2 senators from every state in the United States Senate. Both of those senators represent all of us in the state of Illinois. And so they're senators at large, not single member representatives like we have in the House. The House has been set at 435 members since 1929. In 1929, the Reapportionment Act was passed, which established that 435 would be, in theory, the final permanent number of members in the U.S. House. When Congress began in the late 1780s, there were closer to 65 members in the United States House. Those numbers grew as our population grew. Right? Since 1929, they've decided we have to cap the number because we're running out of space. And so what we have to do is, as we analyze our population every 10 years through the census, we determine how many of those 435 reps each state deserves based upon their portion of the population. Every state gets a minimum of 1 House rep, and in theory there's no maximum number of House reps as long as every state has 1. California has the most House reps right now. They currently have 53 representatives in the United States House because their population is more than 53 times of that of a state like Wyoming, who's only got 1. Through those House districts, the drawing of the districts, once the Census Bureau determines, for example, Illinois, you've got 18 House reps. The Illinois State Legislature has to draw the shape of the districts. Every time the Census Bureau recalculates how many reps you get, even if your state doesn't change in number, become greater or fewer, oftentimes those districts are redrawn through the state legislatures, which leads to a process we know as gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is the drawing of district lines through these state legislatures in an effort to really benefit one political party at the expense of others. It's become much easier over the last couple decades through technology to gerrymander in a way where the actual population and percentage of population, the partisan divide, is not really represented in the election of members to Congress. And so what the Supreme Court has done is generally said gerrymandering is all legal. As long as your intent is to slow down the other party, we're going to back off of things for the most part. Legally speaking, the districts just have to be contiguous. They have to be one single shape, and they have to be approximately the same population. Some court cases that we'll look at through this chapter deal with the issue of gerrymandering when the Supreme Court has stepped in. All right. One of those examples, the first court case, is Baker versus Carr. In Baker versus Carr, the Supreme Court ruled the idea that districts cannot be malapportioned. In other words, one district in a state can't be 3 times the population of another one. They need to be equally proportioned. Today, there's approximately 725,000 people in each district. And by making sure that each district is the same size, we create this theory from Baker versus Carr of one person, one vote. Everybody's vote in each district, in theory around the state and around the country, is the same value of the others. Another important court case is Shaw versus Reno. In Shaw versus Reno, the Supreme Court looked at gerrymandering, but not for partisan purposes, but for racial purposes. And what the Supreme Court has said is racially motivated gerrymandering is illegal. If your purpose is to dramatically increase or intentionally try to decrease the representation of minorities, that cannot be the purpose of your gerrymandering. They'll step in those circumstances. The next topic we get to is party leadership. You should know who the leaders are in both the House and the Senate. The leadership makeup really in both bodies is similar. Both the majority party and the minority party have leaders that guide the direction of the party and policy. Both the majority and the minority parties in both bodies also have whips. Those whips' jobs, as a title, as an objective, is to make sure party members stay in line. As far as other leadership, the Speaker is probably the most powerful member of the United States Congress. As Speaker, you have more power than anyone else. In the House, you really direct and determine not only who's going to chair every committee, you determine which bills are going to move forward, which ones really don't. There's a tremendous amount of power. In the Senate, in theory, the leader is the President of the Senate, who is also the Vice President of the United States, right? He, currently really doesn't attend many Senate meetings or Senate sessions because as the President of the Senate, the Vice President only really gets to vote if there is a tie, which doesn't happen a lot. Therefore, we also have another leadership position called the President Pro Tempore. Right, the President Pro Tem or Pro Tempore is the temporary president who leads the Senate when the Vice President is not there. You'll look in chapter 4, section 4 at the bill to law process, which we'll spend time in class. I'm going to go over it really quickly here. All right, just understand this kind of, schoolhouse rock, simple idea. Bills can start in either body, either the House or the Senate, unless it's a revenue bill. Let's say a bill is a revenue bill. It would start in the House. It would go to a House committee in which they conduct hearings. That committee would report it out potentially. If they don't, of course it dies. 99% of bills die. Once it gets out of the House committee, it goes to a Rules Committee where they'll schedule that bill for a debate on the floor of the House. The floor of the House would debate and vote. If all the members are good with it, then it would go to the Senate. And the Senate repeats all those same steps. It goes to Senate committee, and it would eventually be voted upon by the floor of the Senate. What the Senate doesn't use is they don't use a Rules Committee in the same way as the House because the senators have a power to filibuster, which they can debate endlessly. So it's hard to schedule a bill for debate if somebody's going to filibuster for 2 days or 5 hours. You can't schedule things in the same way. If a bill makes it through the House and the Senate, it oftentimes goes to a conference committee. A conference committee is a type of joint committee with members from the House and the Senate on it, where they'll look at the 2 different versions of pretty much the same bill and they'll come to a compromise. If they can do that, the bill goes back to both bodies of Congress and they have to approve the changes. If they approve those changes from conference committee, then it's sent to the President. The President can sign it into law or he can veto it. If he vetoes it, Congress can try to override his veto with a 2/3 vote. Right? One of the next topics in the book, they deal with Congress and the budget. Recognize that Congress plays a secondary role, but a role of great importance because they're in charge of the money. The President is required by law to propose a budget to Congress in February of every year. That budget would go in effect beginning in October with the new fiscal year. Congress's job is to then take those portions of the budget, run it through their committees, and appropriate money to the different elements of the budget. They might revise the President's budget proposals, they'll sit down with members of the executive branch to discuss some of the proposals, etc., right? But they play a huge role. A lot of the time that they put monies through or they put appropriations through, what we've seen over the last 80 to 90 years, at least of American history, is we always spend more money than we bring in, right? Except for a handful, maybe 5 years in American history over the last 80, we have actually brought in more money than we've spent. Therefore, you have to know the difference between a budget surplus. A surplus is when there's more revenue than expenditure, as opposed to a budget deficit. A budget deficit is what we get 99% of the time, where the government spends more money than they bring in through taxes and other forms of revenue. Our national debt, which is the total amount of deficit that we haven't paid back to this date, our total debt at this point is over $20 trillion. That's adding up one deficit after another, unable to pay them back. And a big part of the reason for that problem is entitlement programs. Right? Entitlement programs are programs that by law Congress has to appropriate money to, like Social Security. Social Security gives money in retirement to elderly individuals. The elderly population is booming. Right? We're getting older and older as a society, and so those dollar payments are going up and up, and Congress does not have a choice if they're following the law to stop those funds. Therefore, the deficit increases and the national debt then. Final thing, all right, look at and understand the different types of personalities of member of Congress. You should know the difference between a delegate and a trustee. I would tell you the number one personality, if we look at it statistically, is partisans. Most members of Congress determine what they're going to do based upon what the party's encouraging them to do. Okay? As a result of that, we have a lack of bipartisanship. We don't get a lot of time right now where the parties are working together, and we get more and more gridlock through Congress. So we'll talk about that more in class, right? But those are some of the main things you should understand from this chapter. See you tomorrow.